Hello and welcome to The Game Changers. I'm Sue Anstis, and this is the podcast where you'll hear from trailblazing women in sport who are knocking down barriers and challenging the status quo for women and girls everywhere. What can we learn from their journeys as we explore key issues around equality in sport and beyond? I'd like to start with a very big thank you to our partners Sport England, who support The Game Changers through a National Lottery Award. I'm excited to say that in this, the 18th series of The Game Changers, I'm talking to founders and entrepreneurs, the women who have set up organisations that help change the landscape for all women and girls in sport. My guest today is Mhairi Maclennan, an elite athlete who has represented the GB team at cross country and on the track, and earlier this year made her marathon debut in London, running an incredible 2:29 and becoming both Scottish and English champion in the process. Mhairi is also the co-founder of Kyniska Advocacy, the UK's only athlete-led and sport-wide safe sport organisation. Mhairi set up Kyniska following her incredibly brave decision to waive her right to anonymity after suffering sexual abuse at the hands of her coach. The mission of Kyniska Advocacy is to create a sporting world that protects, respects and celebrates women in sport. So Mhairi, you have had the most amazing season in 2024. Can you tell us about your marathon debut in London of such an incredible time?
Thank you. Yeah. It was the culmination of a lot of obviously physical training, but also kind of mental, psychological factors. And yeah, it's hard to put words to it, to be honest. It was a phenomenal experience. And I think when I crossed that line, I felt, yes, pride and joy, but also just so much relief that kind of everything had gone okay. And, years leading up to making the decision to move up to the marathon, I'd kind of been plagued with more illness than anything else. And I just, was so glad. I was so careful during the build to not get ill. And I felt really proud to cross the line kind of in just being physically and mentally really well. So yeah, it was good. It was a really amazing experience.
And was that a time you thought you could achieve going into the race?
I think like time goals are something that evolve as you're training for a competition. So when I chose to do the marathon, I didn't think, I want to run XYZ time. I think for me, the goal was do a marathon, be competitive and finish it. And then, yes, by the time I was, 10 weeks into training, I think I had a kind of inkling that I wanted to run under 2:30 and, on a faster course, maybe even faster. But it's a goal that I was kind of less married to, if you like.
And how did that feel in terms of a marathon in itself? I should say I did run London 20 odd years ago in twice the speed that you did. I think that was just over 5 hours, so exactly double the time. But how did it feel as your first marathon?
Phenomenal. We chose London because we knew that regardless of how the actual race went, it would be an amazing experience. The crowds were insane. The running through these streets was really cool. They're iconic. And I was actually saying to my now husband that I think if I'd done London a couple of years ago, it would have meant less because I didn't really know London as a city. When I was in my early 20s, I just didn't spend much time there. But because our relationship had started there, I was running past I remember when we went there or and it's nice that you can also sightsee. So it was a nice first one to do.
What was it like to have that success after the tough few years you mentioned that you've had there? Were you getting to a level that you'd always hoped you'd be at as a younger runner?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's such I don't know why. I've always been very emotional about the marathon, even as a youngster. I think running's or being in sport is weird because your goals evolve, right? So I wasn't one of those kids that sat and said, I want to go to the Olympics. I just didn't think that I would ever achieve something like that. And I obviously still haven't. So it was more kind of, doing a marathon. I think when I was a teenager, I read Paula Radcliffe and Liz McColgan's autobiographies, and I wanted to do a marathon because of that. So it was probably one of the longest standing goals I've ever had. And when I was at home one weekend to do the Inverness half marathon, which is Scottish half marathon champs, I stumbled across like an old scrapbook that I'd kept as a teenager. And in there, it was like things I want to achieve before 30. And one of them was run a marathon. I'm 29.
Phew.
I know. Yeah, it was a hilarious kind of trip down memory lane. I'd also put like fall in love, tick. I was like 14.
And what are your ambitions now? So can I have done that? Is marathon now the distance that you will really go for in terms of future competition, or where are you?
Yeah,
where are you standing now?
I think so. I mean, they take a lot out of you, obviously. And I think maybe that one took more out of me mentally than any other would, just because it's the first one and like I'd had such a rocky start to get there. But yeah, I can't imagine myself doing a load more like 10K training specifically. Like I think I'm quite happy to do them as a part of a build, but I really enjoyed having that kind of long-term goal and everything else has a purpose behind it. Whereas, you know, when you're a bit younger and you've got more energy, more motivation, and you just like, I was completely consumed by my running. I wanted to race every weekend. Whereas now, like, I can't think of anything worse. I just want to like know why I'm doing a race, and it has to have a particular function or goal, or I'm not going to do it, because I also have a life now.
So aside from all you do as an elite athlete, you're also the co-founder of Kyniska Advocacy, a non-profit organisation with an ambition to see policy changes that would make the sporting world a safer, more supportive place. And your journey started when you decided to speak publicly about the abuse you'd suffered. I imagine it must have been an incredibly hard decision for you to make at that time.
Yeah. It was one of those decisions that kind of, it took a really long time to get to the point where I was ready to do anything about it. And I had obviously had encouragement from some, like, you know, my mum had always said, I don't think I had ever really disclosed the full extent of it. She just had a feeling that he was a bit creepy. And, you know, she often said, you really need to speak up about this. You need to, it's your duty. And I just wasn't ready, and I was scared, and I didn't, you know, there's a lot of things that go on in your head when you're in those situations. Like I used to think, oh, I don't want to disrupt everybody else's training.
In the group?
Yeah. And like take their coach away from them. You know, like failing to think I'm actually removing them from harm's way. And so, yeah, it wasn't actually, I didn't do it alone. There were two other young women that came forward with me. And it was really because of them that I came forward. I had left the training group at this point because of other allegations that had been made against him, but nothing had been done about them. And I was training with I had a female coach, distance coaching, and these young girls sent me a Facebook message and said, oh, we want to report a coach and you probably know who. And we were told that you would be able to help. I don't know who told them I'd be able to help, because I really didn't know what to do. But I think I suddenly realized that this was much bigger than me. And it was like I'd been sticking my head in the sand for a really long time, and everything that had happened and everything I'd been told her that he had said over the past 6 years that I had been coached by him came flooding forward, and I felt awful for not having done something before. So I think I really took it upon myself to try and support the three of us to come forward and, yeah, make right what I felt I had been sitting on for too long.
And how old were you then?
So at that point, I was 23, 22, but I had left the group. I think I was 23 and I was 22 when I left the group.
So it had been through your teenage, through 16, that kind of key age.
Yeah. So I stayed way too long in that environment.
And what was the process then from your speaking out with these other young women to almost the creation of Kyniska as an entity? What's that journey been like?
So around the time that we were reporting, there was another athlete who had created an Instagram page called Signpost to Safety, and she had kind of set it up so that there would be a touch point for athletes before they went straight to welfare officers, so they could speak to like a fellow athlete rather than going immediately to the welfare officers, just to kind of create that bridge of communication and it be less intimidating. And one of my friends was a part of it and had shared it on her story, and I saw it and I thought, oh my gosh, that's so timely. And I think I just reached out to this athlete and I said, like, what you're doing is amazing. Just knowing you're here and exist is a huge support to me. I'm going through a reporting process right now. And she reached out and kind of became a huge support to me, like really, yeah, came into my life. And, you know, she was the first person I cried in front of about this. I didn't know her at all, but she'd been through this as well, and she knew what it was like. And it was definitely uncomfortable because I was like, oh, I don't really want to cry in front of this person. And I still didn't really know how I felt about any of it. But yeah, she kind of stayed in touch. And I remember, like, it was beautiful. She sent me and the other two girls like some friendship bracelet that she said like united us through this awful thing that we were going through. And it was really, really touching. And then when initially my coach was given a temporary ban, so I can't remember if it was 3 or 5 years, but it wasn't very long. And she reached out to me when, like, the day that it had been published. So she obviously was like looking out for it because she knew that I would see it. And she reached out to me and asked me how I felt about it. And I also hadn't really thought how I felt about it. I'd just seen it and felt incredibly relieved that I had been listened to and believed and they'd done something about it. And I didn't really think, oh, well, it's only temporary. And when she asked me, it kind of came, again, the realization that he would very shortly be back coaching and in my environment really scared me. And she said, look, I'm in conversations with another athlete and we're thinking about doing a campaign kind of on the basis of your case. And we want to ask for lifetime bans for coaches that are found guilty of sexual misconduct and abuse. And I think because the whole process of, like, obviously being in an abusive, toxic environment and then also going through the investigation, it's so silencing because you're silenced by the perpetrator and then you're silenced in the investigation process because you're told you're not allowed to speak to people and you become really, really isolated. And although this campaign that they were doing was for good, because she said, oh, we're going to do it on your case, I thought, absolutely not. I'm going to be involved if this is happening. So I kind of suddenly like plucked myself out of this quite passive relationship with what had happened to me and said, well, if we're going to war, I'm coming with you. And the other athlete that she was in touch with was Kate, who's the co-founder of Kyniska. So Kate had kind of already written a public open letter to Welsh Athletics about the lack of support she'd received when her coach was imprisoned. And we came together as a three and we worked pretty hard on the letter, which was an open petition to UK Athletics asking for this policy change. And it was quite successful and athletes listened to us. And I think that that's what really rung true for Kate and I. The athlete who had set up the signpost to safety had sort of been battling against the system for some time already. And I think for her, this was the culmination of a lot of years of work and really took its toll on her emotionally. And when we were successful in like getting a meeting with UK Athletics and they said they were going to change the policy, this athlete decided to take a step back and said, I can't do this anymore. I can't be in this space. I don't think it's good for me. But Kate and I really felt like I had just arrived in this space and I'd felt so empowered and like emboldened by this experience that I decided, well, I didn't really want to leave it. And Kate had said, I don't know about you, but I also feel like this is just the beginning. And she had a lot of experience in working in youth parliaments. And at the time I was doing a PhD in Spanish literature. So like I was an academic, like I was sitting reading books and I probably wasn't really enjoying it that much. Like we were just coming out of second lockdown at this time. And I probably felt a bit of a loose end with my life. And so when Kate said to me, look, I want to do this on a more full-time basis. Like I want to campaign. I want to make a change. I think we're good at this and I think we work well as a team. Like, do you want to start a not-for-profit? I kind of just clutched at the opportunity and said, yes, let's do it. And I knew absolutely nothing about policy change. I didn't even really understand what a policy was. I was like, policy, what's that? So yeah, that's kind of how Kyniska came to be. You know, we then I started applying for jobs in policy and public affairs, which I obviously didn't get because I had no experience. And I did an internship at British Heart Foundation in policy and public affairs whilst we were launching Kyniska. You know, we did a bit of research about what we could call it, and we thought what we were doing was reasonably different. We didn't want to have women in the name because we knew that the policies we'd be advocating for would impact and positively, hopefully, impact everybody. But we wanted to make it clear that it had been a woman-founded thing. And I obviously had the literature background. Kate is really into classics. So we wanted something from Greek mythology. We thought that that would give it strength. And we came across Kyniska, who was actually a real historical figure. And that's how we landed on the name.
I love that. And just quickly tell us about, because I'm going to come back to talk to you about athletics, but Kyniska was this extraordinary woman, wasn't she, in terms of all she did?
She was. I'm actually going to also pull up our website because we've been pulled up for getting the exact wording on the history wrong. We actually feature in an article by an academic about misrepresentations of Kyniska in modern times. So how embarrassing. But we were led to believe that she herself competed in the ancient Olympics, which is not true, because actually it was kind of what we would understand to be landed gentry and like rich people, kind of royalty. They bought people to represent them. So she was actually a slave owner, probably ultimately. But women were banned from the Olympic sanctuary during the Olympics and couldn't be a part of it in any way, shape or form. So she was trailblazing in that sense. And so, yeah, she would have been awarded the Olympic crowns in the 4-horse chariot race, 2 Olympic cycles in a row, so in 396 and 392 BC. And so, yeah, she's, as the first female winner, I suppose, in some ways, she paved the way for other women to follow in her footsteps, which they did. And I guess how we posit it is that we are doing the work that she would be doing today if she was still around, particularly because she post facto erected a statue of herself, some of which still remains. And she says in it, "And I alone say, of the women of all of Greece, take this crown." And so she was very bold, very brave. And yeah, we kind of take that energy into what we do.
Lovely. I love that. It's really interesting, isn't it? It's like being called up on the whole, she's a bit of a kick-ass woman, and then actually some academic comes back to correct you on things.
Yeah, the academic was like, it's not strictly true. Like your interpretation, though.
It was great. Yeah, sounds great. And just going back to athletics slightly, when you went, because I think you almost talk over that as if, oh yeah, and then they changed it to a lifetime ban. But that's huge, isn't it? That what did happen there? Were you almost pushing on an open door when you went to see them? Is it something they'd considered? Had it been something they knew wasn't right, that it was this 5-year ban?
I think a bit of probably lots of factors. And obviously I'll never know all of the factors because I don't work there. But as with all of this work, you know, we're standing on the shoulders of the women that have come before us and have trailblazed to be able to even have a place at the table. And I know that the athlete who had started Signpost to Safety had made a lot of inroads, and she'd had a awfully difficult time trying to get and secure meetings. And, you know, we've spoken to people who, you know, they'll say, oh, I'm meeting with so-and-so. And I'm like, well, good luck. Like, we had a really hard time there. And then they have a fine time. And so each and every one of us are making it slightly easier for those that come after us. But I think the door was perhaps ajar. The female CEO, Joanna Coates, who was in position at the time, was really passionate about safeguarding and safe sports. She'd done a lot in her previous position at volleyball, I think. Yeah, so I think the door was slightly ajar. I also think that there had been a lot of negligence on this case previously. Like, I remember myself when I first joined the group in 2013, that my coach explained that he used to take girls back to his house to massage them, but then 2 girls tried to ruin his life. And so now he could only do it at the track venue. And obviously he'd already built trust and a bit of a relationship with me. So I thought, oh, that's awful. Why would those 2 girls do that? But yeah, they obviously reported him. And I wasn't aware. And that's part of, you know, what we do now is like knowing the signs of abuse and knowing the boundaries that you should and shouldn't have with a coach. Like, your coach shouldn't be your masseuse at all or touching you anywhere, really, unless it's a sport that requires physical adjustments, and there they should be asking for consent. So, you know, if I'd known that, I would have been like, oh, right, maybe I'm going to find a different coach. But instead, that's not what happened. And so I think, yeah, in part, people prior to us trying to make change, in part them knowing that this case really needed to be acted on, and many people had reported prior to us. I had left the training group because 2 coaches had reported him a year before we came forward. So we were the last in a long line of reports that had just not been acted on or, investigated properly. And again, we can only speculate why. Perhaps, the evidence wasn't strong enough. Perhaps they didn't see enough, or perhaps the capacity and resource wasn't right, or perhaps they were protecting their own reputation. There's a whole plethora of reasons why that might not have been acted on. But yeah, I think that's why we were listened to, I hope.
And on your website, you share some pretty bleak statistics around the number of girls that have suffered sexual abuse in a sporting environment during childhood. So I think globally, it's like 1 in 5 women and girls. And clearly, reporting abuse is one of the hardest things a woman might ever need to do. So how much does that reporting system and the response to it vary across sports today?
Quite a lot. Yeah, a lot. I mean, we've recently been doing some work with Scottish universities actually around their reporting systems, and it is complicated because sports unions or associations often sit separate to universities, but massive varying procedures and policies. Some universities will have coaching code of conduct, some won't, and same with sports. And I think the sports with more money generally will have slightly better processes and policies because they've got better resources to spend time creating them, and they're not just putting out fires all the time. But that's the problem, or it's a big part of the problem, is that there's no consistency in sport across. There's minimum standards, before anybody holds me up, which are the safeguarding assurances, and they are in place, but they're pretty rudimentary. Like one of them is have a safeguarding policy, and you can download those from the internet. I think a lot of the problem is that overall there's a lack of care and humanity within these systems and these processes. So most governing bodies are going to have a process in place and a policy in place, and they'll never turn around and say that they don't have one. But the problem is, 9 times out of 10, there's something in their policy that they actually never uphold, or they'll say that a particular process is going to happen, and that's not at all what happens. Some of that is just because of resource and demand, but some of that is because of negligence. And I think I recognise the difficulty that national governing bodies have when their purse strings are being tightened and staff are overworked, and actually often safeguarding and the responsibility for it does rest just with the safeguarding team. That needs to change because, we'll come in as an organisation representing an athlete that's come through our support service, and it's the safeguarding team we email and we're like, you guys have failed on this. And they feel like that's a personal attack because the whole responsibility of this just sits with them, and nobody else in the organisation is taking a concerned role, and that's a problem. But yeah, fundamentally, there's no follow through, there's no care, there's no humanity with these things because national governing bodies see a report as a problem and a threat to their reputation rather than seeing it as a learning opportunity and an opportunity to build trust with their sports community.
And how have they responded? So I know it's a bit of a general, all national governing bodies, but how have you found they've responded to your existence and the work that you're doing in this space?
Really varied. Which is why it's hard to answer in general. We've got some really proactive national governing bodies that, will reach out to us and want to speak with us. When we first launched, Scottish Touch Rugby was one of the first governing bodies that got in touch and really, really wanted our help. Others have been pretty hostile. Kate and I have been called naive, incompetent, and plenty of other names. And that's because, I think that the space is filled with a particular type of people or attitude, and we might think that we've cracked it. So often, and this is not to say that there aren't amazing people who have these types of experiences, but work experience, but I think that to assume that everybody who's had those work experiences is amazing is dangerous because we're all different. But there's a real tendency to hire ex-police officers. Now, as well as I do, there's lots of different roles within the police. And just because you've been in the police force doesn't mean that you're going to have the expertise or experience to deal with a traumatized individual. We spoke with one safeguarding officer who quite openly boasted that they had been on murder investigation teams. Now, they might have the right experience, but that in and of itself doesn't tell me anything. In fact, it's a red flag, because it's a bit like, well, if you're used to your complainants being dead, the fact that they're alive is already a huge win. So to have the level of empathy that is required when you're dealing with people who are going through really traumatic things, I'm not sure that you're going to be the best equipped. So I don't want to sit and cast judgments about what is the best work experience to have had to best equip you for the role. But I think, there's just a lack of consistency, and I don't think that I just don't think we've got it right. There's loads of amazing work happening, but it's really siloed and inconsistent across the board.
And you talk about that, I guess, that inconsistency. There's no independent body in the UK at the moment, is there, to review the big cases of abuse right now? So some might say it can be a case of sort of sport marking its own homework, is a phrase I've heard used when it comes to those abuse cases. So why is that? Almost like from an outsider's point of view, it's like, why does that not exist?
Yeah. There's a real reluctance to bring in an independent body. We're actually doing a piece of work with UK Sport around, it's called the UK Safe Sport Project, and it's looking exactly at what is the answer? How do we fix this quite broken function within our sporting world? And a lot of people are nervous about an independent body because they feel that it takes the onus and responsibility completely off national governing bodies to too far an extent, which would leave, people vulnerable to not knowing where to go. Because I think the reality is, if you are in a remote or even rural club, of which there are a lot in the UK because we have a lot of rural areas, you're more likely to know the name of your national governing body than you are of an independent body. So it's the dissemination of information that's difficult. But an independent body also needs to be a standard setter. It can't just be a case management system whereby the really serious cases are referred to them and they deal with them and that's it. They need to be setting what policies people need to have in place. They need to be writing those policies. They need to be probably an education provider as well. And if not themselves providing the education, at least outsourcing and then ensuring that education is rolled out to everybody, because everybody should have the same level of education. Because as it stands, yes, sports are marking their own homework. And your safety, enjoyment, experience of sport depends on your postcode and the sport that 9 times out of 10 you fall into or your parents take you to as a kid. And that's just it's just not where we need or want to be. And so, there needs to be an independent body, but what that looks like and what it's called is going to get people's backs up.
And who pays for it, I guess, as well,
exactly.
too.
How do you ensure it's independent? So what does independence mean and what does that look like? So is it that it's a government body? Is that independent if it's a government body? Is it that the sports councils, do we stretch their capacity and build another function into what they already do? But that would probably require legislation, and governments really don't want to legislate on this because they don't recognise how big of an issue it is, because it's just sport, right? So what does it matter? And who's going to work there? So how do we employ the right people? There's a recognition that we don't necessarily have the right people in these roles. Where's the money going to come from, like you said, and how do we find that money, and how much do we pay the people that are in these roles? And I think when you start talking about an independent body, these are the questions people automatically jump to, rather than what's the functionality of it and how does it work and fit into an existing system where there are already some independent bodies. So football already has an independent body. And how much of sport does it cover? Because at the moment, the way sport's funded in the UK is elite sport is funded by UK Sport, and then the rest is funded by the other sports councils. And how do we get the sports councils to work together to figure out the solution? And I think it's no mean feat, the task that we're trying to undertake to kind of figure out what this looks like and how we might implement it. But like when we if we have an athlete that comes to us, which this is basically all we do, and they say, I've had an investigation, I'm not satisfied, I've been totally re-traumatized by this process, I feel like shit, I don't trust the sport, they've ruined my life. We do a subject access request, we read it, it's awful. We go to the sport and they say, yeah, we've reviewed this with our internal safeguarding panel and everything was done to plan. It's like, well, yeah, of course it was done to plan. If you're checking with yourselves, you know, if I want to give myself 10 out of 10 for something, I'm going to do it. So it's really hard to create true independence. And at the moment, yeah, it's a totally broken system.
That's a bit of a sigh. There's not a reason not to change it. Oh, you mentioned that difference between legislation and policy, and a government maybe not wanting to legislate. In the UK, we have positions of trust legislation, which is there to protect young children and young people and children from abuse by adults in positions of power, of influence. And I know there were some changes made to that this year, I think, which closed a loophole that existed in sport for people aged 16 to 18. So can you tell us a bit more about that and what also still needs to change in that space?
Yeah, so thank you, Tanya Gray-Thompson, for this change in legislation. Amazing. So basically the positions of trust legislation now means that the word coach, or somebody who occupies a coach title position, falls into somebody who has a position of trust. And all that means is that they've got a kind of duty of care over others. And the loophole that they've closed is that it's now illegal to have a relationship with somebody between the ages of 16 and 18 if you're in a position of trust, which is amazing. I've had conversations with Tanya about this legislation, and she's herself frustrated that we weren't able to kind of make it historic. So if people within a certain time period, you know, let's open it up to the last 5 years, they can also retroactively apply the law. And we've, dealt with and spoken with many athletes who would have fallen into that category. And I think the principal reason that they didn't backdate it is because they knew they'd be inundated. But it's a huge step forward in terms of like a actionable piece of legislation that provides protection and hopefully acts as a deterrent as well against something that should have been happening anyway. But yeah, the position of trust legislation is great. I'd love to see it extended, particularly, 16 to 18, yes, absolutely, no brainer. But we know that your frontal cortex doesn't stop developing until you're around 25. And I don't see why we shouldn't be using that as an argument to try and extend it. I think the other thing that we need to recognize, particularly in the UK, is that university age. And I'm obviously passionate about it because I was 18 when the abuse started, and I didn't consider myself vulnerable at the time, but I look back and I didn't know anything. And I think there's lots of factors that can impact people's naivety levels, I suppose. But by and large, people in the UK, in swathes, leave home at age 18 to go to higher education institutions, whether that's college or university. You're away from your parents, you're away from your family, away from your friends. So you're away from anybody that knows and recognises your behaviour. And so much of what we do around educating people in safe sport is around behaviour changes. So recognising that somebody might be experiencing abuse is about changes in their behaviour. So whether it's changes in their psychological behaviour or their physical behaviour. But if you're around people that you don't know, how are they supposed to spot any changes? They just assume that's what you're like. And that was the case for me. And the amount of conversations I've had with people that knew me then and meet me now, it's actually really chilling. And I find that one of the worst things about kind of being where I am now is the person I thought I was when I was at university is so not the person I was, because people have said things like, oh God, yeah, you're just so fun. Like, I don't remember you like this at uni. I remember you being really like introverted, or, you were just seemed angry at the world. You seemed really uptight. These kind of words. And these are people obviously that I'm like very happy for them to kind of have these frank conversations with me, but it's hard to hear because I remember feeling like that and being like that. And nobody could spot it because these people just thought, God, she's a bit of a nightmare. Like, don't really want to spend much time around her. Don't blame them. But that's a huge loophole that then, if the positions of trust legislation doesn't cover older than that, it fuels this assumption that the second you turn 18, you're completely cognizant of everything everybody around you is doing. You won't get manipulated. You can't be abused. And it's really dangerous because anybody can get abused, like smart people, old people, young people, beautiful people, average looking people. It doesn't matter who you are. You're not like exempt because of any characteristics that you have. And so, yeah, I'd love to see the position of trust legislation extended just to protect particularly that age group of that kind of moving to university or college and being away from family and isolated, because isolation is how abusers get people. And if we've already done that work for them by being isolated in the first place, it's so much easier.
And at university, so a professor couldn't have a relationship with a student. That's covered by legislation, isn't it, in terms of that position of power?
No, it is. Yeah, I don't know if I actually would need to check. I don't know that a professor is listed as a position of trust. It sounds like a no-brainer in that it should be, but I don't specialise in education policy. I would be surprised if that's allowed, but it might be. I know when I was at university, there were always rumours of, oh yeah, that professor sleeps with students kind of thing. But yeah, I think it's the kind of thing that you can lose your job over for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. You've talked a bit about athletes coming to you, and I know you're working with UK Athletics now to provide an athlete support service, giving emotional and practical support for athletes going through that reporting process. So is that the majority of your work right now? Is that a lot of what, I know that's not actually the case because there's a whole ream of other things you're doing, but is that the kind of core of the work that you deliver?
Probably not the core, no. It's probably the thing I think is the most important, or it feels the most important when you're doing it. But it's not the core of our work, no. But yeah, the support service kind of was born organically. It was never something that Kate nor I envisaged or planned to do, and certainly not something that either of us had training for when we first started kind of doing this out of necessity. I think because Kate had been public about the struggles she had faced. I had obviously been public and waived anonymity. And then we launched Kyniska. Naturally, people reached out to us if they were struggling. And it kind of got to the point where maybe initially it was people we knew. And so I was very happy to give advice as a kind of friend or, known person. But quite quickly, it became people that we didn't know. And they'd be like, oh, well, do you mind actually also, my friends struggled with this. Do you mind speaking with them? And that was when I realized, okay, we need to formalize this and we need to not to sound like a national governing body, but I need to protect ourselves because I don't want to give wrong advice. I wasn't trained to give advice on this kind of in that capacity at all. So 2 years ago now, we formalised the support service and we've kind of built it out so that, yes, it's a bridge of communication between athletes and their sports governing bodies. We try to kind of take a bit of a bespoke approach whereby somebody comes through our doors, our metaphorical doors. We have a discovery call to try and understand the kind of oversight of what's happened. What is it that they're looking for in terms of support? Athletes don't always know that, and that's okay. And what can we realistically and feasibly do or expect from this, relationship that we try to build with them. And we've got a pro bono legal team that help us if they need specific legal advice, and we pass them on there. We've got a team wellbeing and performance psychologist. So I can kind of do emotional support, but I can't do any psychological support. I'm not a therapist and I'm not a counsellor. So we would pass them on to Natasha should they need anything more specific and robust. And yeah, we've managed to get things like, we've had written apologies from sports. We've managed to get sports teams who recognise, okay, we actually probably need to do some training. So we've come in and delivered some training on how to create healthy and supportive training environments. We have had reinvestigations or investigations where there wasn't one. So yeah, we've also had loads of disappointments. We've also had just no progress and sports that just keep saying, well, they've reviewed it and they've done everything they can. And those are the really hard cases because obviously it's horrible, disappointing the athlete, but I also feel really personally like I'm disappointing a younger me and like I'm being failed by the system again. So long term, I'd love to probably think it's good for my mental health to remove myself from the support service somewhat and, diversify the number of people and voices that are supporting athletes.
And you recently published a superb manifesto for the future of safe sport, and I would absolutely recommend people read it, and I'll add a link to the show notes as well too. And I think one of the things that really shocked me, and I've been in the world of sport for many, many years, so I kind of feel I know the sport, but there's no statutory requirement for sports organisations to report known or suspected child sexual or physical abuse to the local authority or to the police for independent assessment. And so that means that criminality might never reach the police. And I don't know why I assumed, of course, that would be the case. But do you think parents of sports are aware of this, parents of sporting children?
No. And I think actually recently, I'm sure it was SIMSPA did a survey with parents, and a lot of parents actually also thought that sport was independently regulated in the way that the education sector is, and they didn't know that. So when we talk about like education required for the sports sector, parents are a huge part of that. Like for young children in particular, obviously, like if parents don't know, then like where are we going with this? So it's not just educating coaches and staff, it's also educating athletes and parents and like family members, support teams, or whoever it is that's kind of around that athlete. But yeah, parents don't know a lot, and that's scary. We actually deliver a workshop called Creating Healthy Sports Environments, and we've got an iteration of it that's for organisations and for kind of sports governing body leads, and we've also got an iteration that's for parents and athletes. And I delivered one last week to a local running club here, and it's just, it's amazing getting them all in the room. And I usually split the room so that parents are on one side and the kind of under 13, under 15 girls are on the other side of the room, principally because there's also a bit where we talk about periods, and who wants to talk about that next to your mum or your dad. But yeah, the parents want to know more, and we don't, like sports don't take any responsibility or role in educating them on the reality of like what policies are in place in the club. Like, do you have a social media policy? Do you have a safeguarding policy? Who's your welfare officer? And, this was a really, really proactive club because this is the second time they've had me in to do a session. But when I asked the parents and children who the welfare officer was, nobody knew the answer, like literally not a single person. And that's scary because, okay, we're being really proactive in this club because we're doing education, which is not happening like at all or even close to on a wide scale. So you would think this is a really good club, I want to send my kids here, but nobody knows who the welfare officer is. So that's like a missing link. That's such an easy fix. But if parents don't even know who the welfare officer is, they certainly don't know that there's no statutory requirement to report child sexual abuse, and they certainly don't know that there's no independent regulator. And I think that sport sometimes rests on its laurels a bit with that, like, oh, we're unchecked, because the education sector, parents are just going to assume it's the same.
Yeah. Absolutely. As well, when researching, before talking to you, I did lots of researching. You kind of go down a bit of a rabbit warren of watching more, going to more websites and reading, and that whole piece around what we mean by abuse. And I think for many people, after the White Review, etc., we think about sexual abuse often with, athlete A and those stories, but actually just that abuse of athletes in terms of the bullying and domination and that kind of the treatment of athletes is so much broader than, that's almost at its extreme. It's all horrific, isn't it? But actually, when we think about abuse, it's a broader...
Yeah, it's huge. There's a huge spectrum. And I think, sexual abuse often sits at the top of the iceberg, particularly in these kind of relationships where there's a power imbalance. Sexual abuse is usually the last thing that these abusers get to. And before that, there's been this whole host of awful stuff that's happened. And when I think about my behavioral patterns today as an adult and choices that I make or struggle to make, it's not because of the sexual abuse that I suffered. It's because of everything else that I went through. So, you're kind of conditioned and brought up into being this massively compliant athlete, and you're terrified of stepping out of turn because I have learned that if that happens, if I do that, if I go on holiday or if I get ill or if I get injured, I'm going to get frozen out and not spoken to for like weeks on end and just ignored if I turned up to training. And that might seem like a small thing, but that has a massive impact on somebody's psyche. So even today, my current coach is the coach I had as a small child, like when I was still living in Inverness with my parents. And I actually found that was like the only coaching relationship I could make work, because I'm not scared of him. Like, I'm happy to tell him anything and I know that he's safe. But it was so hard for me to learn how to be with another coach because they were new and I didn't trust them ultimately. And I was just always scared of like upsetting them and I think that it's not just around coaches, like that's around everybody. So my husband tells me again and again, like, you need to express what you want and like your preferences more strongly. And I find that really hard because I have been conditioned to not upset a coach, obviously, yeah, so that I, don't suffer the consequences. And so small things and big things, I'm not very good at expressing my boundaries. I'm not very good at expressing what I want. And that's not because of the sexual abuse. That's because of like the emotional abuse, the psychological abuse, and like physical abuse, which would fall into, for clarity, anything that's happening to your body. So if a coach is like forcing you to train through injury or illness, or also using training as a punishment. So like our coach would often send these like insane training regimes if you went on holiday, and like you knew if you didn't do them then he wouldn't talk to you, and you wanted him to talk to you because you thought that if you talk to him and he values you, then you're going to succeed in sport, and you want to succeed in sport. So yeah, there's a huge spectrum, and I think that's the bits that's difficult. Like yesterday I was delivering an all-day in-person workshop with sports leads in universities, and there's a full chapter section that we spent sort of an hour and a bit on around spotting signs of abuse. That's the bit people struggle with, because yes, there's obvious ones like bruises might be physical abuse, and like, okay, if someone's got an STI, like maybe there's sexual abuse going on, but it's more than that. It's like, does somebody become quite quiet? Like, has somebody become nervous when they weren't nervous before? Like, it can totally change somebody's personality. And that's really hard to reverse.
And you're doing some work, aren't you, with a fantastic team at Leeds Beckett University's Centre for Social Justice in Sport and Society around examining those long-term impacts of coaching maltreatment of female athletes. So I guess a little bit about why, you've almost explained why you are undertaking that, but what do you hope will be the results of what comes from that?
So I'm not leading this piece of work. It's actually Kate that's leading it, because her expertise just much better fit that piece of work. But I guess I don't know that we've got hopes necessarily for the results, but I think what we want to show is that impacts from abuse in sport are long lasting. And I think it would be good, if you can even use that word, but to be able to show that the impacts are really varied, all the way from really struggling to stay in employment to, struggling to maintain relationships or being mistrusting in relationships, things like the things that I've experienced, but having data to back it up. And I think we have some of that data when we look at kind of studies around domestic abuse, and they're like really powerful to be able to say to the government, inaction on this costs you X amount every year. We don't have statistics like that. And I think for a long time, perhaps for too long, we've been kind of trying to rest on the moral argument with sports that like they need to change this because it's the right thing to do, because human rights are in law. So, they need to prioritize human rights. But ultimately, sports are businesses and they need money to run. So unless you are going to convince them that investing in safeguarding is going to make them more money, it's going to be really difficult for them to actually make that choice, even if morally they're bought in. So I guess we're trying to do research so that we can use it as a lobbying tool to try and create more change that's backed by data and evidence. And yeah, hopefully we get there, because Yeah, it's a hard argument to make. And I think it's more pertinent than ever now, because with the growth and surge in women's sports and the visibility of women's sports, which is amazing, behind that boom is potentially neglect towards the well-being and welfare of those women athletes that are being catapulted onto the stage. And I went to a conference where they were talking about how to capitalize on this growth of women's sports, and they kept calling it the product. And I was thinking, fucking hell, like, pardon my French, but these are people we're talking about. They're not products. We're not commodities. And if you're shoving loads of games fixtures into a season because you want loads of matches to be on TV because you want to capitalize on revenue, those are people that are having to perform those matches, and their well-being is not being prioritized at all. So I feel like the well-being discussion is like even more pertinent now as we see this like kind of boost in women's sports and trying to maximize the visibility of women's sports, which is a really important thing to do so that we can get on equal footing. But can we do it in a sustainable way?
I almost feel like there's so many, I'm conscious of your time, but there's so many other things I just want to ask a little bit about coaches, because I believe if a coach is banned in a sport right now, they could still go on and coach in a different sport. It's not no central register exists. I feel like I'm just sharing all the bad news, but it is pretty shocking, isn't it? But no central register exists at the moment for coaches. Is that different anywhere else in the world, or is that we just weird in the UK? Because that just feels like madness, doesn't it?
It is madness. It's insane. So in Canada, they do have a register. So you've got to have a login to access the register, and you've got to know the register exists. So it's not necessarily like widely publicized that it exists, but it is there. But yeah, that's correct. In the UK, there's no register. There is pilot work going on to create a workforce register, but the last I heard is that they won't be putting bans on it. So it doesn't really serve the purpose that it needs to, because I think this is the problem with sports bans, right? That like sports can only act within their jurisdiction. So a ban is only as good as the respect that the person who's banned has for that organization. There's nothing written in law to enforce the ban or uphold it. And so if you had somebody who just completely disrespects the ban, they can keep practicing in sport and they could keep coaching. And the most the governing body can do is like keep sending letters to them and telling them to not do it. But there's literally nothing enforceable. And if people don't choose to go to the police, or if it doesn't meet the threshold for criminal proceedings, then that's where it ends. And the ban is only applicable in that sport. So it's not like you get a sport-wide ban. So this happens all the time where coaches will get banned from one sport and they go to another, particularly sports where it's potentially quite easy to like switch that skill set to coach a different sport. So like an individual endurance sport, you know, if you're a running coach, you can probably be a triathlon coach. If you're a triathlon coach, you can definitely coach swimming, biking, or running. And so you see a lot of switching there. But also, if you've already learned how to coach, it's not that difficult to learn how to coach a different sport. If you really want to, it's definitely something that you can do. So yeah, a register would go some way to stopping that from happening, but it also, like, it does need to be a global register really long term, because we've also got loads of cases of coaches changing country and going and coaching in another country. And these are people that, like, they're really dangerous. These are people, and I think that's what we underestimate. Like, if you're going to the effort of changing country so you can continue to coach, that's because you want to continue to abuse. Otherwise, you'd find another job. Yeah. Uprooting yourself so that you can continue to be in a position of power like that, that's not a safe person to have a position of trust with at all. So yeah, the coach license register scheme would be great. And I think that it can also be something that plays to the advantage of coaches who haven't done anything wrong as well, because you could use it as, okay, well, you know, I've had to look for a coach before. I could go onto this database and I could filter it by region. I could say I want a coach who specializes in marathon training and who's got expertise in female athlete health. And then you could find a great coach, and like actually it becomes kind of like a LinkedIn for coaches. Like it could be something that's like a really useful tool, as well as keeping sport safe.
I feel like it's not been a positively uplifting conversation, but in terms of hope for the future, and I guess the changes that we are seeing, and you're doing you and Kate, some incredible work in this space. So how hopeful are you that we are shifting and moving kind of each time there's a policy change and legislation and so on?
Some days I feel more hopeful than others, but we are seeing a difference. Like I think when I'm feeling really downtrodden, you've got to step back. And I do think you've got to look back as far as 5 years, maybe 10. But when you do that, there's a huge difference, like, okay, when you come forward, you might have a horrible experience, but at least you're coming forward. And that might sound piecemeal and like it's just not good enough. I agree, it's totally not good enough, but there is change happening and it is slow. And to an extent, we need this change to be slow, because cultural change that really works is slow. We can't just change everybody's ideologies and psyche overnight. I wish, but we can't. Maybe today I'm feeling hopeful. Other days I feel less hopeful, and like working in this space is incredibly exhausting and it's really draining. And I know that Kate and I have definitely sometimes looked at each other like, why have we done this? Like we could have had nice lives, where we're not faced with trauma every day. And yesterday was one of those days. Actually, I had had a really positive workshop all day with these sports leads at universities, and everybody seemed really engaged. And I was just like, oh, that's brilliant. And then I got a call from a journalist asking for us to comment on Stuart Hogg and his court case of domestic abuse. And I was just like, fuck's sake. Like, what a shit way to end the day. And that is kind of what this space feels like. For every good news piece, it feels like there's 10 bad news pieces. Yeah. And it's very easy to get really downhearted, but must keep the hope alive.
Who looks after you? How do you make sure you and Kate are...
Probably not very good at that. Louis, my husband, is great. And in fact, without him, I probably wouldn't have even come forward because he was so supportive. But yeah, I think both Kate and I are really guilty of just not looking after our own well-being because we always put other people's before our own. But I think we're kind of getting to a place in our team where, there's 7 of us now, and there's 4 of us in a sort of, management type position, but not really, because we're very non-hierarchical, but we're very good at being like, you look like shit, you need to take the day off, or like, you need a break, you've been doing too much. Like last night, where actually the journalist had asked for a comment by that evening, I didn't write it, even though the request had come to me. I just said, guys, I need to go to bed, and they were like, go to sleep, I'll do it. So yeah, it's a learning curve.
And the work you're doing is so important. So how have you been funded, and is kind of future investment, where does that money come from to enable you to do the incredible work you're doing?
From the projects that we've delivered. So at the moment, I've literally just gone full time at Kyniska as of like coming back from my honeymoon last week. But we always said that I would go full time when we had like a 1.5 to 2 years runway. And we've been able to do that because people have trusted us to deliver work for them. And also because I got shouted at to stop accepting work for free. That was also a learning curve. But yeah, we're now in a place where we've got enough kind of projects in the pipeline, have done enough that I can be paid. But yeah, we've not got any kind of formal funding. We're only just starting to apply for grants. I think Kate and I, when we first launched, we were just so focused on trying to get some change and like making sport a better place that we sort of forgot that we would need money to do it if we wanted to do it in a more full-time capacity. So yeah, fingers crossed for a couple of grant applications that we've sent out, and yeah, the projects continue coming in.
And in closing, if you could ask one thing of listeners of this podcast or people working in sport, what can we all do to help make sport a safer place?
Great question. I think there's an awareness piece. So I think part of it comes from my background is in education, and I was a teacher before this. So I think that if everybody has an awareness, then collectively we'll be better at spotting these patterns of behaviour and less tolerant of them. Sport doesn't exist in a bubble or a microcosm, so this is a societal problem. It's about culture, it's not a political thing. So I think like sharing, liking, like any kind of organisations like the Army of Survivors, Sport and Recreation Alliance, like ourselves, sharing work that we're doing, following us, liking our stuff, I think can create a kind of collective awareness in the sports psyche. But, going and finding out who your welfare officer is and telling your club that the welfare officer doesn't just need to be there and exist, but also needs to be visible. So small things like when a new member joins the sports club, reintroducing all of the key members of the committee, including the welfare officer, making sure that there's a social media policy in place for online harm, that there's a safeguarding policy in place. I think it's like doing checks at your local level, because that's what we can influence in our immediate sphere. But I also don't want to like put too much on the individual, because ultimately the big organizations need to change the way they're doing things. But we do all have a role, and I think you can overcomplicate it until the cows come home, but ultimately it's like, be nice and treat people with respect and humanity and humility. Don't be a dick.
Goodness, what a privilege it was to talk to Mhairi and to hear about the incredible work she and the team at Kyniska Advocacy are doing. If you'd like to hear from more trailblazers like Mhairi, there are over 200 episodes of The Game Changers that are free to listen to on all podcast platforms or from our website at fearlesswomen.co.uk. Along with trailblazers and entrepreneurs like Mhairi, you can also hear from elite athletes, coaches, broadcasters, scientists, journalists and CEOs, all women who are changing the game in sport. As well as listening to all the podcasts on the website, you can also find out more about the Women's Sport Collective, a free, inclusive community for all women working in sport. We now have over 8,500 members across the world, so please do come and join us. The whole of my book, Game On, The Unstoppable Rise of Women's Sport, is also free to listen to on the podcast. Every episode of Series 13 is me reading a chapter of the book. Thank you once again to Sport England for backing the Game Changers and the Women's Sport Collective through a National Lottery Award, and also to Sam Walker, who does such a brilliant job as our executive producer. Thank you also to my lovely colleague at Fearless Women, Kate Hannon. You can find the Game Changers on all podcast platforms, so please do follow us now and you won't miss out on future episodes. Do come and say hello on social media, where you'll find me at Sue Anstis. The Game Changers. Fearless Women in Sport.